Yaf is here in Shoshana. Okay, so let's wait till Yaf and Shoshana come in. And hello. Okay, so I guess we're not done with defense mechanisms because we're studying it again today. This is one more, at least one more topic that I wanted to talk about. I don't know who this is. Who could this possibly be? Let's see. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is fear of death. And in a certain sense, we've been discussing defense mechanisms as protecting the ego. Well, the thing that the ego is most vulnerable to in the end is to death. And certainly the argument could be made that in the end all the defense mechanisms are protection against the death of a certain part of the ego. And so the all-encompassing need for a defense mechanism would go to the actual fear of actual death, not just of a part of the ego. So anxiety from death is certainly the most prevalent defense mechanism that we have. The question is, and what we're going to try to address today is, can it be sublimated? Is there any way to take the fear of death and the defense mechanisms that develops and to sublimate them and to turn them into something positive? So the truth is, one could argue that most of the good that's done in the world is a sublimation of our fear of death, the fear of one's own demise. But before we get to that, before we discuss altruism as the sublimation of the fear of death, I want to take a step back and I want to look more at what it means that we have a fear of death. Albert Camus, the French philosopher, once said that the death is something that always happens to other people, meaning that the inability to cope with death is so powerful that we can't even imagine our own demise. We can't even consider it in our minds. And so in Chassidus we would translate that as the ego cannot imagine its own demise. But, and here's the big but, that one might say that all of Chassidus in a certain sense is an attempt to consider that exactly. And although we talk about in terms of self-nullification, is really focusing on exactly that, the demise of the ego. Being able to imagine what it would look like if my ego was no longer. Then the question becomes, if I can imagine that, if I can see my own self-nullification, what am I left with? So the theory outside of Chassidus would go that if you consider your own demise, if you're willing to consider the ego's end, the feeling that everything is revolving around me, right? Everything that goes together with ego, then perhaps there's no life after that. Maybe that is what death is. But in Chassidus, the understanding is that that's where life really begins. Meaning that we haven't begun to live until we have freed ourselves from the ego. And when we say freed ourselves, we don't mean suicide. We don't mean ending life. We mean freeing ourselves from the debilitating need to have everything revolve around us. That this is probably, especially when a person is younger and still enjoys very good health. So the biggest sickness that we have is actually our inability to sublimate the sphere of death by actually accepting it. Accepting that death is inevitable. But again, in Chassidus, the sublimation is not to think about my own physical demise, which is part of that process that's called death, but rather to think about the death of the ego, the ability to function without the need to cater to the ego, to the I, to the self. And that's what we call self-nullification. So it actually turns out that nullification, self-nullification, is the ability to consider fully and to meditate upon our own demise, our own end. Now, we stressed a lot of times that in Chassidus we don't get rid of the ego totally, we just rectify it. But in order to rectify it, you have to kill it, per se. And that's how the Tanya starts the book. And he says, the example of a person who had two souls is David. And how do we know that he had two souls? Because it says that he was able to kill, literally that's the word, she'arago, he killed his animal soul with fasting. Fasting was how he broke through the limits of the animal soul and discovered the divine soul. If we would compare this to our discussion of defense mechanisms so far, then, like we said, repression and transference or projection and denial correspond to the three worlds: action, formation, and creation. And then we said that at the level of emanation, there's no more need for defense mechanisms because there's no ego. So when we first started talking about this, we said that God doesn't have defense mechanisms. So anything that's on the level of the world of emanation doesn't need a defense mechanism because it accepts, whatever is there, accepts the fact that there's no ego. So what we're saying now is that if we're able to break through the barrier between creation and emanation, between the rational mind and nullification, which is wisdom, the world of emanation, then that is the ultimate breakthrough against death. So another way of saying this is that in order to sublimate our fear of death, our anxiety of death, we have to reach a place where we can imagine, accept the fact that our whole existence is not ego-centered, that all of existence was really for something else. What is it for? So this is what we learned in Faith and Confidence and Jewish coaching, that the whole point of existence is to fulfill some divine mission. And that divine mission is coming from the world of emanation. That's our souls at the level of emanation. And so to connect to that divine mission, which is really egoless, it's not looking at things as centered around me, but rather centered around what God wants, that itself is the breakthrough that allows the sublimation of the fear of death and the anxiety caused by death. And therefore, a defense mechanism is no longer needed, in a certain sense, against death. but we're not always very capable of doing that. We're not always able to do that. So therefore, the fear of death continues to linger, and defense mechanisms build into our psyche from the moment pretty much that we understand that we're mortal. So what do these defense mechanisms look like? Well, the usual one is, I don't want to hear about it, right? That's the usual one. People try to ignore it. People try to brush it under the rug. They try to do this, try to do that. They don't want to hear about it. Or, like I said from Albert Camus, that death is something that happens to other people, really. And it's not related to me. I can't accept that fact that it's related to me. But we see that the fear of death develops the altruistic defense mechanism. And I want to share with you a piece from Rav Kook. I don't normally bring him here, only because usually I'm able to find something in Hasidic writing that's in my opinion better exemplifies it, or that I'm more aware of, I'm more familiar with. But in this case, there's one passage that really stuck with me since the days that I was studying Rav Kook a long time ago. He has a passage on the fear of death in his book Orot HaKodesh, The Lights of Holiness. So I don't have a translation of it, so I'm going to translate it as in real time, hopefully get the translation as good as I can. And so I'll share the screen with you, just so that you can see what I'm looking at. Okay. So again, this is in volume 2 of the Lights of Holiness. And he writes like this: Yirat hamavet hi machalat ha'adam ha'klalit. The fear of death is the general malady, or the all-inclusive malady of mankind. And so this is obviously talking about what happened in the Garden of Eden. God said that if you eat from the tree of knowledge, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, because the moment that you eat from the tree of knowledge, mot tamut. And this phrase mot tamut is translated into English as you will surely die. You could also say you will eventually die. Another way of describing this is, instead of saying you will surely die, you say mot tamut, you will be anxious of dying. Meaning, because you'll be anxious, you'll fear it, eventually it will come. Because the angel of death is also called the angel of fear. He instills fear in people's hearts. You know, I keep coming back to, I think somebody corrected me a while ago that it was Eisenhower maybe that said it, I'm not sure, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So the same idea here, that it's not the death itself that kills the person, but rather the fear of death. And the fear of death can many times cause people to deny it. And again, that's the defense mechanism, but that's not a sublimated defense mechanism. Just to deny it, as we know, denial needs to be sublimated. So what kind of sublimation occurs, we'll talk about in a moment. We've started talking about it, but what I see is more important is that if it doesn't go through sublimation, if we're not willing to talk about it and we're not willing to sublimate it, then we might go through our lives denying it, and that's much worse. Because what happens when a person denies the fact that he's going to die? Well, the first thing that he feels is that he has an infinite amount of time. I'm never going to die, and I can just spend my time procrastinating with life and not doing what's important, and figuring that I'll always have time later. So, like any good procrastinator, by not accepting the inevitable, person ends up catering to their needs, to their cravings. Instead of delaying satisfaction and gratification, a person always wants to receive now the pleasure that is there. And so it's not very surprising that when you're so fearful of death that you can't even admit that it exists, you have to deny it, it's not surprising that you become nihilistic. You become nihilistic because in the end you can't find a way to sublimate your fear. You can't find a way to make it into something positive. So again, this is the general human malady, and it causes perhaps all the evil in the world. It could be that the root of all the negative things that people do, where they pursue their cravings because they have all the time in the world, where they pursue passing and fleeting things because they have all the time in the world to do that, that is, says Rav Kook, that's the general malady of humanity. So it's very interesting. If should we pray, for instance, that death just suddenly be removed? If death were suddenly removed, what would happen? Would the world be a better place? So according to what he's saying, if I'm analyzing it correctly and saying that the reason that this is the general malady is because we're in denial, because most of humanity is in denial of its own death. So if God would suddenly remove death, then humanity would be stuck with its cravings. There would be nothing to help us sublimate these cravings that come out as a result of feeling that we have infinite amount of time. So the denial has to be, first of all, sublimated, has to be fixed in some way in order to allow us to really become free of death. Meaning, I hope you understand what I'm saying. It's like saying that if God would remove death before we've learned how to conquer it, and conquering it doesn't mean ending death, but rather sublimating the denial of death. If we haven't learned how to sublimate it yet, and God would remove it, then we'd be stuck with all the negative traits of having a defense mechanism against death. The defense mechanism would not suddenly disappear. That's what I'm trying to say. This creates, again, we said that all defense mechanisms, when they don't mature properly, they create psychosis. So the psychosis of every individual on this planet, the basic psychosis, as he calls it here, the general psychosis, is one that is a result of not having sublimated our fear of death, our denial of death. Another way of saying this is that in order to conquer death, we first have to sublimate its defense mechanisms, or the defense mechanisms that it awakens in us. Now, the image in the Torah regarding what happened after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of life is that they were exiled from the Garden of Eden. But that wasn't it. The second stage was that God placed two angels to guard the path of the tree of life so that man would not be able to live forever. And what did he place with these angels? The spinning sword. La tacherev mitapechet. And everybody agrees, all the commentaries agree, that the purpose of this sword that's spinning around and these terrible looking angels is to cast fear on those who would tread and go and eat from the tree of life. So now the question becomes, is it possible to overcome these two angels and the spinning sword? And the answer is yes. What's the recipe? What's the remedy? The remedy is what we just said. It's being able to overcome our fear. If we can overcome our fear of death, if we can change, transform, and as we've been calling it, sublimate the denial of death, the fear of death, the anxiety we have from death, then the path to the tree of life becomes open. So again, reaching the tree of life, reaching immortality, is dependent upon conquering fear, and specifically our fear of death. This reminds us a lot of something that I also quote a lot in our classes, that when Alexander the Great met the sages in his lifetime, he asked them, what should a person do in order to live? And the sages answered, he should die. What does that mean? What do you mean, kill yourself, and through that you'll live? So the answer is, you have to meet your demise head on. You have to sublimate that fear. You have to get over it. If you can't die, meaning if you can't accept, if you can't get over the denial that death is not going to happen to me, you won't be able to live. So it's a very important passage in the Talmud. It's in Masechet Bechorot, in Tractate Bechorot. And it's an amazing statement. It says, the path to eternal life is open. It's not as close as you think it is. But in order to get to it, you're going to have to sublimate death. Your denial of death. You're going to have to do something about that. The question is, what do you do? Okay, so here, Rav Kook is going to give us the remedy. Again, and the remedy again, I don't think he means here, here's this potion, and just drink the potion and you'll be fine, you'll live forever. We're not talking about some elixir. Rather, we're talking about the psychological work that a person can do in order to free themselves from denial of death, in order to sublimate the denial of death. And he says like this: החטא יצר את המוות, והתשובה היא התרופה האחת להכחיד אותו מן העולם. So, sin created death, and tshuva, meaning repentance, is the only way to strike or erase death from the world. So tshuva is the remedy. And what do you mean by tshuva? Tshuva means not just that I do tshuva over my sins. Tshuva means to return to the origin, meaning to get back into the Garden of Eden and eat from the tree of life. That's really what it means. Now, we've maybe talked about it more or less, but as we said, denial of death is very much related. It's the source of the world of creation. In God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the four-letter name, so which letter corresponds to the world of creation? That's the first Hey. And the bottom Hey, the second Hey, corresponds to the world of action. And we know that the Zohar talks about tshuva ila'ah and tshuva tata'ah, higher tshuva, supernal tshuva, and lower tshuva, mundane tshuva. And the way that it's explained in the Zohar, in the Tanya, he quotes this a couple of times, is that tshuva should be divided into two words, as it were. Tashuv, Hey. The first four letters, Tav, Shin, Vav, Beis, and Hey. And which one are we talking about? So it could be either Tashuv Heilah or Tashuv Heitata. It could be either to return the higher, the supernal Hey, or the lower Hey, meaning to return the world of creation to its origin, or to return the world of action to its origin. Here we're talking specifically about tshuva that returns, that takes the world of creation and puts it back in its origin in emanation. That's where its origin is. And the way we understand this, what we just explained, is that if I can take my life and return to my origin, meaning return to my purpose, return to the reason for which I'm alive, which is the mission I have in life, that is the remedy, the only remedy to death. So the remedy against death, the way to fight, to combat death, the only way possible really is by embracing my life's mission. That really becomes the key to it all. The more I can connect to the world of emanation, the more I can connect to self-nullification, the more I will be able to defeat death. And again, death here means the demise of the ego. Okay? So let's continue. Now he explains the malady. The malady is that because of our denial of death, he says, everything that a person toils for in this world is in order to save themselves from death. What could he possibly mean? What do you mean everybody's toiling in order to save themselves from death? That doesn't sound right. People are toiling because they want to enjoy their lives. They want to make money in order to have food. They want to make money in order to have a house. They want to live. So why would you call all this toil that's meant to save us from death? It doesn't sound very right. There's something a little off by that. So what does he mean here? I think what he means to say is that people are looking for ways to cheat death. That everybody's work is meant to cheat death for a while, to work against entropy. But we know that that doesn't work for a long time. It doesn't really solve the problem, because eventually entropy will catch up with you. Eventually everybody finishes. So do people really have in the back of their heads the idea that everything that they're doing is to try to run away from death? If we understand it as a defense mechanism, then I agree. If we understand, I think that this is the way to understand what he's saying. That if everything we're doing is part of a defense mechanism, a denial against our own demise, then it might perhaps be that all the toil that's done in the world is predicated, it's caused by this defense mechanism. And again, it needs to be sublimated. Something needs to happen to it. But really, he says, "Lo yavo lematrato ki im bagdilo et nishmato mimkora pnimi." The only way to come to the goal of winning against death is by going to the source, which is to enlarge, to increase one's soul from its an inner source. And the inner source of the soul, we've talked about this maybe once or twice, that even the souls are taken from the world of creation. It's called from the throne. The throne is the world of creation. The inner source of the souls is not in the world of creation, it's in the world of emanation. So here we have again an allusion to the same idea. השיקוע באפר החומריות וההתלהבות הנפשית בכל ערכיה הוא רק מגדיל את המוות וממילא הוא מוסיף יראה על יראתו, וכל מה שיתאמץ אדם שלא להתערם פניו לא יועיל לו כלום, מאחר שהוא משקיע את כל הווייתו בתוכנים כאלה שמוות שולט בהם והוא מארסם ומכלה אותם. So he says, all the things that people pursue in this world, the materiality, even the culture, even the spiritual things, as it were, that people are pursuing only increase death. Why? Because you have more to lose now. You begin to fear it even more because look at what you've gained. And there's a feeling that a person has, imagine this, is a very accomplished, violinist. He hasn't pursued material things, he's pursued his violin playing. And as he gets older and older, what is he afraid of losing? He becomes afraid of losing his violin. He's afraid of losing his contribution to music. So maybe that's a good thing. He says no, because in the end, the pursuit of music even is in the end a byproduct of the denial. Meaning, I'll say it a little bit differently, that you come to a place in your life where you say to God, it's almost people try to bargain their way out of it. And they say like this, God, why would you want me to not continue to live? Because look at what I'm creating. Do you really have a violinist who's as good as me? It's a very interesting story that I heard from Rosh Steinsaltz, that there was somebody who came to the Sfas Emes. Sorry, not Sfas Emes, Chidush Erim. He was the first who created the Chassidus of Gur. And the first Rebbe, he learned by the Kotzker. And he came to him and he said to the Rebbe, Rabbi, I need you to pray for me. He says, why? Because the doctors say I'm going to die. So the Rebbe said, so, and if you die, what will be the problem if you die? It's a very interesting line of thought. He said to him, what will the world be missing if you die? So he said, there's nobody to take care of my young children. So the Rebbe, in what would seem like to be a very terrible answer, said to him, don't worry, I'll take care of them. So now, why should you not die? Very interesting. He says, why should you not? Meaning, in other words, he was taking him through this argument of, in order to live, you have to be willing to die. So the question is, if you would die, what would be missing? You're willing to die, so what would be missing now? It's the only way you can figure out what your mission in life is. So he thought a little bit more, and he said, if I die, there won't be anybody to daven in front of the Yamud, there won't be anybody to be the Chazan on Yom Kippur. And the way that I sing, whatever piece of liturgy he mentioned, nobody else does. So the Rebbe thought a little, and he said, you're right. For that, it's worth living. So I bless you that you'll be okay, and you'll be healthy, and whatever. And that worked. So again, we try to bargain what we can contribute as a form of denial instead of taking it as the remedy. The fear of death, when it's sublimated properly, it should cause a person to come to an understanding of what his life is really about. So this person, very interestingly, the Rebbe told him, your life is not about your children. Why? Because if a person feels, even by young children, if a person feels that that's their contribution to the world, they're making a grave mistake. Because whose children are they? Who is keeping them alive? Who is raising them? Who is really making them into who they are? If a person feels that it's his responsibility, I made them, so he's missed the point. He's been entrusted with them, he has some responsibility towards them, but in the end, they have a direct relationship with God just like the parent does. I, as a parent, have a direct relationship with Hashem, and they have a direct relationship with Hashem. If I take ownership over them and say, they can't make it in this world if I don't take care of them, then, in a sense, I'm arguing against God's role in a person's life. And that's a grave mistake. That's not the reason why I'm here. It's a very important lesson. I'm not here to take care of my children, especially if I'm a man. By a woman, you could say, and in early years, you could say that there's more to it. But by men, it's not. That's not my mission in life. My mission in life is something different. It doesn't mean that I don't have to take care of them. It just means that I won't be able to break through. I won't be able to sublimate. Or any sublimation of the fear of death should not lead me to the conclusion that I'm here just to take care of my children. I have to find more. There has to be more to it. And so when you said, I'm the Chazan on Yom Kippur, as foolish as that sounds, that's more. That is something that somebody else won't be able to do. That is something that God himself doesn't do, because God doesn't come down suddenly and sing the Yom Kippur davening. What does he do? He creates a person, and he gives the person the gift of a voice, and that person does it. So that's his mission. But that's not the same thing as with children. The children, the mission is only to give care. It's not the same level. It's very interesting that we make this mistake. We think that we own our children. And if it were not for us, they would not be able to get along in the world. And that is perhaps one of the casualties of our denial of death. We begin to think that our mission really is to take care of our children, and that's not what we're here for. A lot more than that. Okay? So let's continue. התרופות האמיתיות שבהן העולם הולך ומשתחרר משעבוד המוות הן גנוזות באוצר החיים, בנשמתה דאורייתא המתגלה בכל גילויה והולכת ומסתתרת בחביון עוזה, or חביון עוזו. Hard to tell what he meant. What is he saying? He's saying the true remedies to free humanity from the burden, from the bondage of death, from being enslaved by death. Because again, he argued that most of what happens in the world happens because denial of death is not sublimated properly. So the true remedy, he says, is hidden. It's concealed in the treasure of life. Otzar Chaim. Rav Kook is famous for talking in code. He almost never said what he meant. Why did he do this? I don't want to get into the whole all the discussions about this. But the bottom line was that he felt that he needed to speak in a language that was close to him, and not in the language that was used by all the sages of Kabbalah and Chassidus, in the 500, 600 years before him. So he invented a language. Usually his language is not very hard to decipher because he uses phrases that we find in the Zohar, that we find in Chassidus related to something. Here, Otzar Chaim, the treasure of life, is usually a synonym or an idiom that's connected to what we call the infinite aspect of God, specifically either to the world of emanation or to the world of primordial man. That's usually where it comes from. So when he says, again, he's saying in different language, you have to go up to emanation. You have to go up to somewhere higher. And then sometimes it's called Nishmas Adoraisa. It's called the soul of the Torah. What is the first remedy? Longevity. Well, as if I didn't know that. He doesn't mean longevity in the sense of a long life, whether I live 150 years or 2,000. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about what it says about Avraham. That Avraham came with all his days. V'Avraham zaken ba bayamim. He came with all his days. He's old, not because he's reached the age of 100 and, in this case, he was 103. No, he was 140 years old. He lived for another 35 years after that. It's not because of that he's called old. He's called old, says the Zohar, say Chazal, because he's coming with all his days. Every day is long. And to be long, we know the long continents, Arich Anpin, means that every day was full of my will, of my ratzon, of my ability to want something. And that again ties into our idea of the sublimation of death being related to finding my mission. That the moment that I find my mission, I know what I want, it becomes possible for me to sublimate my denial of death. So that's the first and most important remedy, he says, for fighting the denial against death. Arichut yamim, he says, bichdei hashi'ur hamaspik letivo shel ha'adam, haruchani v'achomri, ha'ishi v'mishpachti, ha'olami v'medini. He says every person has different definitions for what it means to have a long day, to have a full day. There's not one size fits all, because every person has different qualities when it comes to their physical needs, their spiritual needs, their family needs versus their personal needs, their global needs, meaning how much they think of society at large, and even what we call their political needs. All these things are different from person to person. If Avram had a day in which he didn't meet a new person, if Avram had a day in which he didn't meet a new person and didn't get a chance to publicize, to speak to them, to publicize God's presence, for him that was a day lost. That's the type of person Avraham was. If he didn't have a guest that day that he could have this interaction with, he lost a day. So for every day to be long, he had to sit in the front of his tent and wait for guests, even on the third day of his circumcision. One had nothing to do with the other, because every day has to be used to fulfill what's important to me, what I want, what is part of my mission. And that is essential to fighting off the denial of death. Every day I know I have to make a list. These things are important to me. This is what I see as part of my mission. I have to have this list, and it has to sit in front of me until I know it by heart. I have to define it first, which is what all of Faith and Confidence was about. But in the end, it boils down to, what do you want? What do you really want? What in the end is your purpose here? How do you see yourself? If my purpose is to give tzedakah, we'll talk more about that later. If my purpose is to give tzedakah, I would do well to give tzedakah early in the morning, so that right away the day is full. It's one of the most heartbreaking things I've seen on the internet is this thing that's going around by a 5-star general or a 4-star general in America, who argues, who he talked at some commencement at some college or university, I don't remember where, and he told the people there, the graduates, I want to talk about making your bed first thing in the morning. His argument was, even if you've had the most terrible day, when you come back home, it's just very sad. It's just good to be able to know that you've accomplished one thing today, even if nothing else worked. But you accomplished something. What did you do? You made your bed. Two things hurt me in that, caused me mamish to cringe. One is, you used the best moments of the day. He's right. The first 5 minutes are crucial. They are what's going to make your day long. And we're sublimating the denial of death. What happens if I don't come back today? Forget about having a terrible day. I guess if you're in the army, a terrible day could mean that you blow up and die. So is the accomplishment that's going to give you the feeling that you filled your day going to be that you made your bed? What does a Jew do when he gets up? The first thing I need to do, the first thing I do is I say thank you to Hashem. I thank you for trusting me and entrusting me with another day. I wash my hands and I begin to daven. So I don't say everything maybe, but I say part of it. What's the second thing I should do? Make my bed? If all I'm interested in is having some minimal satisfaction from life, then maybe making my bed is great. Because most chances are that I will come back home and my bed will be made, and it's like a delayed sense of gratification. Look, I did something, I accomplished something today. It was making my bed. Why shouldn't the first act be to give tzedakah? The very first thing that I do. Again, if tzedakah is what's important to you. If doing kindness to others is what's important to you. But do it the first thing in the morning. It needs to be right away. Because he's right. You need to use those few minutes in the beginning of the day, not because people say you can accomplish a lot more in the morning or this or that, but because this is what I'm about. I get a chance to define what I am about. And if that's all I accomplished today, I don't need the satisfaction from it. I need to know that I performed my mission. I need to know that there was purpose to my life. And the moment that I have purpose to my life, the moment that I'm connected to my mission, I can sublimate the rest of the day my denial of death. I can say, this could be my last day. Maybe it is. But I know that I've done what needs to be done. I know I've done why I came here. I've fulfilled the reason for which I came. Because again, I don't get to decide how long my life is going to be. But I do get to decide whether I'm going to pursue my will, my true will, what I'm really here for. So I don't want to put it off until the end of the day. I don't want to sit down and the first thing that I do is eat breakfast, because that's not what my life is about. I'm not saying not to eat breakfast. I'm not saying don't eat breakfast. I'm just saying, what are you going to do with the first half hour? What do we do with it? So each person has different needs, a different mission, a different way to feel that they're performing their purpose. But that's what makes the day long. The day is long or short based on the first half hour. If I can fill the first half hour with those things that sublimate my denial of my own demise, then I am sure to have a long day regardless of what comes next. That's the real remedy. As he says here, it's the first remedy for everything. כשברכה זאת מתפשטת בעולם, הולכת יצורת המוות המטלת אימה ומתבטלת. As more and more people understand this, as this blessing, the blessing, what's the blessing? That first of all, I thank Hashem that I'm here entrusted with another day. And I begin to do something with the first half hour, first hour. The more that will spread around the world, he says, the more people understand that that's what you need to pursue in the first half hour, 1 hour of every day. And if you need to get up earlier because you also have to take care of kids, then get up earlier. Make sure that the day is long. So the more that this blessing spreads, he says, the more the fear of death is alleviated. And we conquer it. Again, what does it mean to conquer the fear of death? Not to be in denial of it, but to be able to sublimate it into something else. And as we said, that something else is searching for my purpose, searching for what I'm about, what my life is about. So these are pretty important things that he says. He continues on discussing many parts of what this is. I want to add something more about what denial of death causes. So we're going to stop here with Rav Kook for now. Maybe we'll revisit it some other time. What I also want to talk about is something that I received from Daniel Shalit. He's a professor of philosophy, and he's very connected to Rav Ginsburg. And Daniel Shalit sent me and a few other people one of his thoughts that people are trying to cheat death with technology. What am I saying? I'm saying I'm not referring here to attempts to just use medicine to lengthen life. What I'm talking about is the human-machine interaction. So I don't know if you've seen any of these things, but they've already been made into movies. They started out in the 1970s by a guy whose name is Ray Kurzweil. And he's a Jew, and you can look him up. You can look him up in Wikipedia to read about him. He was a genius. He was a child prodigy, and he was the first one to build a synthesizer in the 1970s. So he had a Kurzweil music company, whatever. He made a lot of money from it. He did this at quite a young age. And as he grew up, and he was very smart and was working with computers and doing all kinds of things with computers, and you can also think about, the very interesting interaction between a person a musician and a synthesizer and how that all works. So he began considering more and more what man-machine interfaces would look like. Till eventually he came to the conclusion that the way that we're going to beat death, the way we're going to be victorious over it, is that we are going to upload our consciousness onto a machine. And basically we'll figure out a way to take our consciousness and scan it, which he understood as very materialistically scanning the brain and extracting all the information from it and figuring out how to store it. And then, since he believes that consciousness is just a byproduct of the complexity of the brain, if you had a machine that could mimic all the information in the brain, all the connections, all the complexity of that organ, then that machine would become conscious just like our brain is. And so our consciousness would be preserved, but in a machine. You can go a little bit further. You can come and say, well, if my consciousness is already on a machine, why not connect that machine to legs and to a body? If it's already online, why not give it a physical form? And so then you get into something called a cyborg, which is some kind of connection between human and machine. And that becomes, in the eyes of many people, a type of an abomination. Is it being closed-minded or not? We can argue about that. But I don't think it takes a lot of thought to realize that this is one of the results of not being able to sublimate denial of death. Meaning there's this such an incredible need to cheat death that, and again, it's because of the materialism, because there's no belief in anything transcendent. There's nothing like the soul. The soul's not needed in Kurzweil's picture. The soul is just the byproduct of the complexity of the matter. So says Daniel Shalit, this becomes the word would, I don't want to use the word abomination again because that's too harsh, but it becomes a fantastic picture, incorrect picture of how to pursue sublimation of death, because it's really not sublimating anything. It's just trying to continue to deny the fact that there's death. That's really what it's doing. And again, it's missing the entire point that it is possible to sublimate this fear. And protection of the ego is necessary. Again, like we said about all defense mechanisms, they need to mature. So the fact that here's how we rectify the ego here. We're not against the fact that there is a denial of death. We want to transform it. We want to sublimate it into something higher. And the sublimation of the fear of death is, or the denial of death, is to embrace our mission in life. There are a lot of philosophers that went in this direction. This is something that's begun to develop really since the Holocaust. The Holocaust was one of the main things that caused people like, now his name escapes me, remember in a second, what was his name? Everybody knows his name. It's just me that I'm drawing a blank on his name now. The Vienna, we've talked about him many times. The philosopher from Vienna. Anybody remember who I'm talking about? He argues that all of life is about logotherapy, that all of life is about finding meaning. How did I forget his name? Viktor Frankl. That's his name. So Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor himself, he found interestingly he didn't go in the direction of taking care of other people. Who took that path of providing for others, like Avraham, was Levinas. Levinas saw the fulfillment of a person's mission in encountering the infinite in the other, in other people, in bridging that gap. But they all have something in common, which is that they say exactly what the sages said, that to sublimate the fear of death, the denial of death, you have to find out what your life's mission is. You have to find the meaning, what gives you meaning in life. And again, the argument is not that by finding the meaning you're running away from death, because that can't be done. Death is going to catch up with you eventually. But you're sublimating the denial. And like every defense mechanism that's transformed into something positive, it becomes a vehicle, it becomes the motivation for everything that we do. It becomes something positive. All the defense mechanisms are not negative per se. They just need to go through this transformation. And I would say, again, as we started, we don't have enough time to complete everything I wanted to do today, but with what we started, that the defense mechanism, the granddaddy of them all, is this denial of death. And if we can sublimate that, then really we can sublimate all the other ones. Because this one is the fear of death, as we said, it's the one that cuts directly to the ego's existence. Okay, so it's been an hour, and unfortunately, again, I didn't get a chance to go through everything. I think this is important enough that we might do one more class on this next week. I really hope that this is taking you into a good place, because I know that whenever I speak about these things, that sometimes it's hard to get through the first fear of talking about it, because somehow if we don't talk about it, it's not there, and we're saved from it. But I really think that this is one of those things that requires a lot more discussion. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about it this week is exactly because of the week's Parsha. And that's the thing that I really wanted to develop, and I didn't get to it. In this week's Parsha, we read about the building of the tabernacle. The tabernacle, a sanctuary, something that's sanctified, is what one might say is what's constructed once you're able to sublimate the denial of death. The sanctuary is the place where death does not anymore present something that needs to be feared. And it's a very interesting thing that we all know, I'm sure everybody's heard, that the priests, especially the high priest, was not allowed to encounter death in his life. He wasn't allowed to go to even his parents' funeral. He just sits Shiva on it. Why? So the usual explanation was, you can't mix life and death together. The whole purpose of the temple, the tabernacle, is to bring life, and the priest should not be chasuf. How do you say chasuf? Should not openly encounter death, because that would ruin the whole purpose of his work in the temple. But what we're explaining here is that it's a little bit different. It's not that would affect the priest negatively by showing him death, but rather that the space in which the priest operates, the place where the Kohen operates, death has already been sublimated. It's already something else. There's a lot of death in the temple. There's a lot of slaughtering of animals going on. But the slaughtering is not understood as a Schadenfreude feast. It's not the joy of slaughtering that's keeping it going. On the contrary, it's the understanding that everything has a purpose. And when the purpose is served, death takes on a completely different role. The death becomes the motivation. It becomes the positive motivation behind finding our purpose in life. It means, in other words, that the tabernacle is sitting in the world of emanation. There's no need to take it down into the world of creation where death exists, because its whole point is to provide a space where death really serves its purpose, which is to motivate life. It's no longer the fear of death. It's no longer death in the sense that it is outside the temple. It's something entirely different. As we said, it's been sublimated, and now it becomes a catalyst for life. And so in that sense, taking the Kohen out of the sanctuary would be like taking ourselves out of our mission. There's no reason to do that when you really already have found your mission. There's no reason to take you away. In fact, you should continue to pursue your mission more and more every day. So that was really the thing that I wanted to develop in relation to this week's Parsha. I also wanted to connect it to Shabbos, and why when you're building the sanctuary, you don't have to... The building the sanctuary does not override Shabbos, but once the sanctuary is built, it does override Shabbos. And that would lead, hopefully maybe we'll get a chance to speak more about this next week. So for now, I'm sorry that I also have to end now. I can't take questions, but if we have this again next week, then we can talk about it. We can hold you, maybe try to remember the questions until next week. So thanks a lot for coming. And the class, as usual, will be up in a day or two on the Patreon, and it will also be up on the Torah to Nefesh WhatsApp group. All the best to everybody.